In this video, we're going to go over the Pendulum Trap, Moving Platforms, and Lunge Trap modules, which all utilize the Respawn module. Now, these are basically animated interactive elements that you can drag and drop into your space to add some interactivity without the need of any code or anything like that. And these are pretty common game elements called either hazards or traps or moving platforms. Now, if we go over to the Respawn module, it's basically made up of two elements. The trigger object, which uses a warp component, which is a Mona tool for creating this kind of functionality, as well as the yellow box that you see there, which is the spawn point that the warp trigger is gonna send us to. So if I step into the warp trigger, we respawn over by the yellow box there. Now when you drag and drop these into your spaces, if you want to go test them, just go ahead and bump into the little warp right there and it'll spawn you in the yellow box. So now moving on into Unity, I just want to break this down for you a little bit. The way that you would modify any of this, so let's say for example that you decided you wanted to add a few more moving platforms or anything else, pendulum trap, whatever, or you wanted to use the respawn element for some custom feature that you have going on in your space, you can just come in here and you can modify the trigger object that includes the warp component to spawn the user, and then you can modify your spawn point to wherever it is that you want your player to spawn when they come in contact with that space. Now once you're done with modifying everything, you obviously don't need these highlighted areas or even the spawn point yellow box to be visible, or maybe you do, but if you don't, just go ahead, click on the object, click on your spawn points, go to the inspector, uncheck mesh render, go to your warp object, uncheck mesh render, and you're good to go. Now, of course, you can customize it however you wish, drag and drop the respawn point and modify it however you want, but we're gonna go and show you how to create one from scratch so that you understand what's going on here. So I've created a couple objects. I've got a warp trigger that we're going to use as the trigger for the warp, and then our spawn point for where we want our player to spawn. Now first things first, I'm going to change the spawn point. I'm going to add the is trigger to the collider that's on it so that it's not a solid object that we can't touch, our player can't touch, or is going to collide with when it spawns. And we're just going to stretch out this box here, this cube that we're going to utilize to trigger our spawning. Now I'm just going to go ahead and put it here, and we're going to add is trigger so that it too is not a solid object that our character will bump into, but it will walk into it, which will look a little bit odd, but this is just for demonstration purposes. So now with the object that I want to be the trigger for the warp, I'm just going to go to the inspector, click on add component. I'm going to type in warp, select mono warp, and now we're going to go to our spawn point object and we're going to drag and drop that to the warp point. And that's done. Now if we want, we can use rotation, meaning that when the character spawns, it's going to spawn in the forward direction of our object. Or if we leave that checked off, the player is going to spawn facing the direction that they were facing to begin with when they entered the warp trigger. Now on interact is just so you can trigger a warp based on the user actually looking at the object and pressing E. But for right now, we're just going to focus on this. So that's pretty much it. We should be done. Let's just go ahead and test that. So we'll walk into our trigger, our warp, and there we go. We spawned facing the forward direction. So if you want to take a look at that again, we're facing this way, but we spawned in this direction because if we look at our cube, the forward direction is determined by the blue arrow right there. So if we were to turn that, modify that, we can change the direction that it's actually spawning, or we can just turn it off completely and it will spawn in the direction. You know what, let's just go ahead and test that. it'll spawn in the direction that we're facing when we enter the trigger that instigates the warp. So as you can see, it spawned in the direction that I was facing. There you go. So back in Unity, I want to show you a way that we can utilize that respawn module to get crafty with it to create even more game-like or interactive story-like interactivity. So for example, the Lunge Trap, as you know, if you step on those spikes when they are exposed, the player is going to respawn. And we facilitated that by in the spike pads object, which animates up and down, we also have a cube, which includes our warp volume. So if I turn the mesh render on so you can see it, you can see that that's where our warp trigger object is located. So it turns on and off so that when the spikes are up, if the user touches it, they respawn. You can also utilize that, if you can imagine, on an animated enemy that walks around, and if the player touches them, they'll respawn. Or any other kind of object. Let's say you have a doorway that when you walk through it shoots some spikes. You can have those spikes have the spawn the warp volume component on it, so that when it touches the player, they will respawn. And there you go.